All right, so just a couple of months after the Democratic establishment decided that it was super important for them to go down to South Texas to defend Henry Cuellar, one of their most right-wing anti-choice corporate members of the party from a progressive challenger, he is now introducing what is probably one of the single worst pieces of legislation that I have ever seen introduced by a Democrat. So here from Julia Conley of Common Dreams, she says, propelled to victory by Democratic leaders, Cuellar says that $7.25 is too much for millions of workers. So what are they talking about here? They say labor experts and advocates on Wednesday expressed disbelief and outrage as the details of an unconscionable new bill purporting to expand flexibility and choice in workplaces came to light, condemning Democratic Representative Henry Cuellar for proposing the gutting of the minimum wage protections. So he's trying to frame this as expanding flexibility and choice within the workplace, when all this bill is going to do is the exact precise opposite of that. Okay, basically, this piece of legislation, if it's going to be passed, I don't think that it will be, hopefully at least not, but if this bill ends up getting passed, all it's going to be is like Prop 22, which we saw in California, at the federal level. And what that means is it's going to allow for companies like Uber, DoorDash, Lyft, etc., all of these gig economy workplaces to classify their employees not as employees, but as independent contractors, and will effectively disable them from being rewarded with minimum wage protections or benefits or overtime protections, etc. So it is absolutely one of the most anti-worker policies that I have ever seen. So they continue here saying, the Worker Flexibility and Choice Act. Okay, again, look at what he's fucking calling this. The Worker Flexibility and Choice Act was originally announced by Cuellar and his Republican co-sponsors, like Representative Elise Stefanik, somebody who literally voted to overturn the 2020 election, and Michael Steele on July 20th, but it wasn't until Wednesday that law professor Vina Dubal shared the text of the bill on social media, describing the proposal as terrifying. And they say, aiming to create a new classification for people working in the gig economy for companies like Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash, the bill would amend the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 by establishing worker flexibility agreements in which a worker will not be treated as an employee for federal tax purposes and is not subject to the minimum wage and overtime protections. Keep in mind, a lot of these corporations like Uber and Lyft and DoorDash, they literally would not be able to function as profitable businesses if it wasn't for the insane amount that they are extracting in surplus value off of the backs of their workers, because they do not have to pay them minimum wage or give them benefits or give them overtime protections or any of that, because they are not classified as employees. So these gig economy companies are complete fucking scams. They are a fraud. They are a scam on working people. And he is trying to basically establish that standard as acceptable at the federal level. Okay, so completely fucking ridiculous. But they continue here saying, the proposal would not only affect gig workers, said Dubal, but would also carve workers out of minimum wage and overtime protections whenever an employer sets work schedules using algorithms and incentives instead of providing secure hours. So this will affect not only gig economy workers or people who work for those companies, but also the entire economy, the entire workforce, because similar to how workers right now face a downward pressure on wages because of the inherent threat under a capitalist system of becoming homeless or starving as a result of losing your job or losing your health benefits along with losing your job. This will basically create, instead of just having an unemployment pool of workers, you will now have also a pool of workers who are working within the gig economy who are not given any benefits or minimum wage or overtime benefits, etc. So this is going to have, if it is passed, a massive downward pressure on wages for everybody in the entire American economy who works for a wage. But they continue here saying, in other words, said former New York Times labor reporter Stephen Greenhouse, it seems to empower any employer, not just gig companies, to tell any worker, if you want to work for me, you must agree that we won't follow minimum wage or overtime rules. Okay, so again, not just those gig economy companies, this is also going to apply to any company. This will allow any company where workers are already, in some cases working multiple jobs to make ends meet, they're already underpaid, they're already in very difficult positions in their lives, and they're being forced to accept jobs that they otherwise wouldn't want to be working. Now it's just going to add another layer of pressure on top of that, because now they would have to potentially sign contracts with their employers to where they would no longer be classified as employees and no longer guaranteed all of those other benefits. But They continue saying, Rebecca Dixon, the executive director of the National Employment Law Protection or Law Project, noted that the bill is being backed by the corporate lobby group, the Coalition for Workforce Innovation, which was established to fight against growing workers' movements. And they say the proposal is an attempt to capitalize on the notion that flexible working hours, Dixon said, but because the Fair Labor Standards Act, the FLSA, is already compatible with worker flexibility, it would be a fatal mistake for Congress to create a carve-out for companies that demand worker flexibility agreements of their workforce, and instead of actually providing flexibility, as Uber, DoorDash, and Instacart have already done to their workforce, it would empower employers to force workers to work for long and hard hours to eke out a living. So again, I mean, those are the basic outlines of this. I mean, it's a pretty simple bill here, but the consequences of this are like completely unimaginable. This would destroy even the, small semblance of an American labor movement that we have right now if this was able to get passed, because you would be completely undercutting not only gig economy workers, but people at any company, any worker who is in a precarious position within their life to where they have to accept a job because, they have to pay the bills, they have to pay, the rent at the end of the month. They are going to have to accept a lot of these new contracts if this bill is passed because they have no other fucking choice. So again, the underpinning, message here is that we have some sort of a free market that's completely non-existent under capitalism. There's no such thing as a free labor market under an authoritarian system like capitalism. You always have that pool of unemployed workers, the threat of becoming homeless, the threat of losing your health insurance, the threat of not being able to feed your family. That is always underpinning the so-called free labor market. So there's nothing free about it. But on top of that, this would also have added consequences for every other worker within the workforce, even if you aren't somebody who's necessarily in a precarious position, because now you're going to have not only an unemployed pool below you, but you're also going to have a gig economy below you that is growing massively by the year, and that is going to create downward pressure on your wages as well. So again, thank you Nancy Pelosi and Jim Clyburn and the rest of the Democratic establishment for going absolutely balls to the wall to save this guy from a progressive challenger, Jessica Cisneros, who could have actually been fighting for a $15 minimum wage as a absolute minimum, somebody who would have been pro-abortion rights, somebody who would have been pushing for universal health care and things that the American people overwhelmingly want in this country. But instead, they chose to go out and bat for a guy who literally doesn't even believe in the minimum wage, okay? Not only does he not want to raise the minimum wage, he wants to undercut it. He wants to get rid of it. He wants to make minimum wage fair labor standards completely meaningless. So this is a perfect embodiment of how the Democratic establishment works as a controlled opposition, right? They would rather put their pressure on crushing leftists within their own coalition than they would on crushing Republicans within their own coalition, okay? They would much rather prefer somebody like Henry Cuellar, who doesn't even believe in any of the things that Nancy Pelosi claims to believe, than they would have somebody like an AOC or another member of the squad who is actually fighting for the things that Nancy Pelosi claims to believe. I mean, again, just a complete exposure of the fraud of the Democratic Party on the American people, that they actually give a single solitary shit about any of the things that they are talking about. It's absolutely ridiculous. But just to put it a little bit more in perspective here in terms of the consequences of the gig economy, they say here from the Economic Policy Institute, they say national survey of gig workers paints a picture of poor working conditions and low pay. So some key findings from this survey that they did. They say about 1 in 7 gig workers, 14%, earn less than the federal minimum wage on an hourly basis, and more than a quarter, 29%, earned less than the state minimum wage that would be applicable if they were a W-2 service sector worker or somebody who was classified as an employee. So almost 30%, right? 29%, almost a full third of gig economy workers are paid less than their state's minimum wage. Okay, so again, this isn't about like creating fair contracts. It isn't about like expanding worker flexibility or anything like that. This is about gutting wages. Okay, that's all that this is about. Serving the interests of these corporations who profit off of extracting surplus value off of the backs of their workers, engaging in rampant exploitation, ruining a lot of people's lives with the structure of how these gig economy jobs work, and turning around and forcing them to accept less than even their state's minimum wage. But they continue with more details, saying that 3 out of every 5 gig workers, 62%, lost earnings because of technical difficulties clocking in or out, compared with only 19% of W-2 service sector employees. So 62% lost earnings just because of like technical difficulties of having to work with Uber and Lyft and DoorDash. Just completely fucking ridiculous. They also say 1 in 5 gig workers, roughly 19%, went hungry. Okay, 1 in 5 gig economy workers went hungry because they could not afford enough to eat. 30% used the Supplementary Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, within a month of the survey. 30%, okay, think about that, are having to use food assistance because these companies who are profiting to the tune of billions of dollars a year are not paying them enough to be able to fucking feed themselves. Okay, and they say that's twice the rate of W-2 sector employees, which is at like 15%, which is already completely ridiculous in and of itself, but they continue saying nearly 1/3 of 31% of gig workers did not pay the full amount for their utility bills in the month prior to the survey. So, I mean, listen, you can look at the data here, you can see the consequences of the gig economy. And again, it's very important to understand these businesses like Uber and Lyft and DoorDash, they are not real businesses, okay? They aren't innovative. They didn't, break into a market and disrupt it and like create something that is big and bold and changing society. No, they just used fraud, okay? They used fraud to get massive capital injections to try to take over a lot of these industries. With Uber, it was taking over the taxi industry, using their influx of capital in order to undercut the price models of previously existing taxi services. Now they're raising them back up to where they're just as, if not more expensive than taxi services. They rely on a mass exploitation of their workers, and at the end of the day, all this legislation is going to do is expand the gig economy and have absolutely disastrous consequences for working people across this country. So, thank you, Nancy Pelosi. Thank you to the Democratic establishment for showing us exactly what type of a person that you want to have within your coalition. Somebody who you said was a valued member of your party.